Okay, so you guys are great. You guys have actually started typing in the chat feature where you're calling in from. So we should get things started. Today is a big session. A bunch of people are on the call, and we're also live streaming this to you too. Hopefully, if that's working correctly. So my name's Heather Riggs. I'm with the New England Museum Association. I want to welcome you guys all today with our co-hosted webinar with the Greater Boston Museum Education Roundtable. They will be presenting on virtual education programs. So in the chat feature, just make sure that you do to all panelists and attendees, because that way all the attendees can actually see who's on the call today. So if you want to do that, today is a webinar series instead of our town hall. So this is the reason why you're only seeing our faces. So if you guys do have any questions, make sure you type them into the Q&A questions, and then Adrian will be talking to our presenters about that one. I also want to welcome you guys to check out the NEMA website for future town halls and webinars. We will be having another webinar on June 15th for interactive museums, mainly children's and science museums. So if you guys are interested in that, definitely check out the NEMA website. We also are open to any type of town hall or webinar. If you just want to get in touch with the NEMA staff on that one, that would be great. So I'm actually going to turn it over to Catherine to introduce the panelists and to get us going.
Great. Thank you, Heather. Hello, and welcome to Down to the Details, Museum Education Goes Virtual. My name is Catherine Shortliff, and I am the engagement manager with the trustees at Fruitlands Museum in Harvard, Mass. And I am also one of the steering committee members for the Greater Boston Museum Educators Roundtable, or a little bit easier to say, GBMER. And we're really excited to be partnering with NEMA today to gather virtually with you all and share lessons and ideas as we continue to work while our museum's physical spaces remain closed. For those of you who might be unfamiliar with GBMER, we provide opportunities for professional development and networking and connecting with colleagues through free, engaging workshops and events. The goals of GBMER are to build a community of Boston area museum educators, create dialogue about best practices in the field, offer opportunities for professional development, and increase the visibility of museum education in the area with non-museum education audiences as well. I want to thank you all for your flexibility in joining us today for this program that was originally scheduled last Tuesday. In solidarity with Blackout Tuesday, we decided to pause this conversation last week. And as museum educators, we have an opportunity and responsibility to engage in discussions of race and amplify Black voices. And we will continue working with the museum educator community to do the work to be actively anti-racist. This session today is the first of two sessions. The next, Down to the Details, will be focusing on public programming side of museum education. And we're currently accepting proposals for presentations. So we would love to hear from you if you have a program that you would like to share. More information can be found on our Facebook page, and submissions can be emailed to us at gbmerinfo@gmail.com. And I'll add that info to the chat box as well in a minute, so you have that reference. Heather already mentioned some of the logistics of using the Q&A function. My fellow steering committee member, Adrian, will be monitoring the question box and chat box, and will be able to help facilitate our question and answer sessions. So we've built in 5 minutes after each presentation for questions specifically related to that program, and also have some time at the end for more general Q&A. So if you feel like you missed a chance earlier in the program, you will have that other opportunity at the end as well. So now I'm going to pass off to our panelists to quickly introduce themselves, and then we will dive on into our presentations. So maybe I'll help facilitate the order of introductions here. Adrian, do you want to quickly say a hello?
Sure. As Catherine mentioned, I'm her fellow GBMER steering committee member who worked to put this webinar together today with the help of NEMA. I'm going to be monitoring the questions today and also kind of wrapping up towards the end of the hour as well with Heather's assistance. So thank you all for attending today. And again, thank you for your flexibility as we rescheduled this webinar.
Carolyn and Kate, you want to say hey?
Hi, I'm Carolyn Collins. I'm the Education Program Manager for Historic New England, and you'll hear from more from me in just a minute.
And I'm Kate Cooper. I'm the Education Program Coordinator at Historic New England, and I run the school programs at the Pierce House Museum in Dorchester and the Quincy House Museum in Quincy.
All right, and over to Jessie and Brooke.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jessie Magyar. I'm the School and Family Programs Manager at the ICA Boston.
Hi, everyone. I'm Brooke Chiavelli, Family and Art Lab Programs Coordinator at the ICA Boston.
All right, and Kate.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kate Malazzo. I'm the School Programs Educator at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum and also part of the GBMER Steering Committee. Had to make sure I get that right.
Awesome. All right, so we're gonna pass the baton off to Carolyn and Kate to get us started.
All right, thank you very much. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge my feelings of helplessness, anger, and insignificance in the face of the current events. I'd also like to acknowledge that Historic New England was founded 110 years ago with an explicitly white, male, wealthy, and heterosexual worldview, and that work is ongoing both in the education team and the larger organization to rectify the lack of diversity in much of our interpretation. That's not the focus of today's program, but it is work that we are actively doing. So Kate, as she said, is one of 5 education coordinators in 4 states at Historic New England. Each coordinator is working with their local audiences on various types of remote programming. Some of them are also attending today, and we can take questions at the end about other things we're doing beyond colonial trades, which is the program that will be our focus. First of all, some very brief background about Pierce House. It was built in 1683. The Pierce family bought it a few years later and then lived in it for 10 generations before selling it to Historic New England in 1968. Around 2000, we turned it into a center for school programs with 1 period room and 3 multi-purpose classroom spaces. Pierce House programs are geared towards elementary age students and based on extensive primary source documentation saved by the family. Colonial Trades is our 3rd grade program. It's based on an account book kept in the late colonial period by Samuel Pierce, a farmer, and covers several 3rd grade Massachusetts state learning results. On-site at Pierce, it's a 2.5-hour program. There's also a 90-minute classroom version, and both have the same required pre-visit work. During the pre-visit, students are assigned the role of one of the tradespeople that appear in Samuel Pierce's account book. Colonial Dorchester was a rural area with a primarily barter-based economy, and the objectives of the program are for students to learn about various jobs that existed at the time and how the community depended on each other for goods and services. The program itself has several discrete components. There's a slideshow introduction to Historic New England and the Pierce property, including conjectural architectural drawings and period paintings. There's an overview of the jobs with illustrations and reproduction artifacts, a then and now matching game, pairing up objects from today with reproduction colonial artifacts that serve a similar function, a bartering game, and on-site programs also include time in the period room, and all students are given a cardboard loom to practice the job of the weaver, and those are theirs to keep. Once we knew students would not be returning to school this academic year, we started thinking about which programs could be translated to online learning. We knew from experience that Colonial Trades is flexible. Several years ago, Kate and I started offering a 30-minute version at the Topsfield Fair and thought some components could work. Unfortunately, that did not include the pre-visit, which is so helpful in giving students ownership of their job, or the bartering game, which is the most popular part of the program. However, the introduction, explanation of jobs, and then and now all seem suited to delivery over Zoom or Google Meet. Luckily, the principal and 3 3rd grade teachers at my son's school, where I've been a frequent visitor on behalf of Historic New England since my older son started kindergarten there 7 years ago, agreed to be guinea pigs at the end of April, the same week that I had been booked to visit them in person. By this point, all schools in Beverly, where I live, had switched to Google Meet from Zoom because of security concerns, so that was the platform we learned to use first. Historic New England has an institutional Google account and was able to provide Gmail addresses for us, which was useful both in keeping home and work separate, to the extent that that's possible at all these days, and because there's some additional functionality with an institutional account, including the ability to set up meetings for yourself, which both Kate and I use to practice. I should mention here that our IT team have been incredibly helpful, kind, and nimble during this time while we're all learning new skills and attempting to make use of new technologies. We estimated that the entire experience would take about 40 minutes depending on the level of student engagement and barring technical difficulties, with 20 minutes devoted to the introduction and jobs and 20 minutes for the then and now. That's proven about right, and having 2 chunks has given us flexibility. If there's one primary lesson we've learned, it's that every single classroom teacher situation is different. For example, my son's teacher is a young guy with no kids who's able to meet with his class for an hour every morning and wanted the complete program on one day. The other 2 teachers each have very young children and working spouses and all the complications so many of us are dealing with, and are only able to have full class meetings twice a week for half an hour each time. They both requested that I attend both meetings in the week, presenting half of the program each time, and it really does work well either way. I'm gonna pause for a second to share my screen. All right, so for my presenting setup for Google Meet, I use Google Slides for the slideshow, the internal camera on my laptop, and a secondary USB webcam. For the introduction, I present the slides while the teacher calls on students with raised hands to unmute themselves to answer or ask questions. So we go through, all right, and do our introduction, talking about who we are and what we do, the 6 New England states, the Pierce House as it looks today, and a little bit about Dorchester, how the house looked when it was first built in 1683, a later addition around 1712, and then finally in 1765. So at this point is where we ask students to compare the 1683 structure with the 1765 one, and they have the ability to have their voices heard. Although Kate will talk in a little bit about differences between classes and teachers and how this works with different classes. We then show a painting of the farm with outbuildings and this barnyard view, which is not actually of the Pierce farm, it's a different farm in colonial Dorchester, but it gives us a chance to look at some of the animals that the Pierce family raised and talk about what we get from each of those animals, which is important as we go into our jobs. We also talk about different crops that the Pierce family raised. So then that leads us into the jobs, and this is the farmer who we've just talked a bit about, and one of the animals that we talked about is the cow, and the different things we get from cows, including the skin of the cow, which is important for the shoemaker. At this point, we have a shoe. This is a reproduction shoe. In the classroom, we would pass it around for everyone. But we talk about the farmer trading with the shoemaker. The shoemaker trades away his shoes. The farmer trades away that leather. But then also other materials that go into the shoe, including what holds the heel on, which are nails, which are made by the blacksmith. And so then we have nails from the blacksmith. We talk about that relationship as well, which leads us to the housewright, who sometimes needs some hired hands. Also working with wood is the wheelwright, who makes wheels of all different sizes, including a small one for the spinster, who makes yarn from that farmer's sheep's wool. And finally, the weaver, who uses that yarn or thread to make cloth. And so throughout this, we are talking back and forth with the students, having them look at the artifacts through the camera as we talk about the different jobs. For then and now, I would, in Google Meet, toggle between my secondary camera, which was focused on the objects, to the main camera once an object was chosen, so we can discuss it close up. Kate, who we'll be hearing from in a minute, has presented using both Meet and Zoom. In Zoom, the slideshow is on a PowerPoint, and unlike in Meet, you can have two cameras going simultaneously without having to toggle back and forth. However, in case that doesn't work, Kate has also prepared a slide for when she can't use the second camera. In that case, she shares the picture of the then and now objects and then holds up the individual objects to her computer when talking about them. And using the colored dot helps to identify which object they choose, especially if they don't know the name of the item. So the thing with the green dot in the then section is our lantern, which we compare in a variety of ways to the modern flashlight. And again, this is where we've called on a student, and the student walks through all of those differences and similarities in materials and construction and in use. So I'm going to have Kate jump in here and talk about her experiences with various classes and teachers.
All right, hi there. So I've been doing these virtual presentations for almost 2 months now, so I thought I could share some practical tips I've kind of learned along the way. So I just wanted to stress that just like our on-site field trips, although we are presenting the same content every single time, each virtual session has a slightly different feel to it because the teachers and students are all unique. But my first tip is to have a backup plan. The first time I went to present, I could not get my slideshow to open. I had practiced multiple times over and over again, and although I knew how to share my screen, it just wasn't working. But I didn't panic because I had printed copies of the slides that I was sharing in my screen share, so I knew that I could fall back on those if I needed to. Eventually, I did get my slideshow to open, but knowing that I had a backup plan helped to keep me calm when I was a bit nervous already about presenting for the first time. And ironically, this morning, I did a class at 10:30 and everything went perfectly well. And then at 11:30, my slideshow wouldn't open. But again, knowing that I had those copies was helpful, even though eventually it did work. So just have a backup plan. My second tip is to really get to know the difference between Google Meet and Zoom. Some schools are using Google Meet and some schools are using Zoom. So you will need to adapt your presentation accordingly. In Google Meet, when you screen share, you cannot see any of the students or the teacher, which makes it a little bit trickier. In Zoom, you can see everyone while you are screen sharing, and you can add a second camera to be used at the same time, which you can't do in Google Meet. Be sure to check with each teacher about what platform they're using. So even within the same school and within the same grade, some teachers were using Zoom and some teachers were using Google Meet. So don't assume that it's the same across the board. And let the teachers know ahead of time that you will be screen sharing. Some of them needed to grant me access or permission to screen share. One teacher wasn't able to figure out how to grant me access, so it may have been blocked by their administration. But I was able to email her my PowerPoint and she could screen share it and just advance the slides for me. With timing, as Carolyn said, we're offering this program in either one 40-minute session or two 20-minute sessions. So I would just give yourself a few minutes to allow students to log on as well, because sometimes that takes a little while. And for the most part, these timeframes have been accurate, but I've run into a few classes that were scheduled for the two 20-minute sessions. And because the students had so many questions, it turned into more like two 40-minute sessions. Knowing ahead of time that the teacher kind of allowed me a buffer of extra time, it was okay for me to go over, but just be mindful because that's not always the case with every session. And then mute, unmute, and chat. I'd say one of the most challenging parts of presenting virtually is not really knowing how each teacher runs their virtual meets ahead of time. Be prepared for different approaches. Some teachers have all their students muted and had them raise hands to answer questions, and then they were given permission to unmute. Other teachers let the students mute and unmute on their own. Others kept them all muted and they were only allowed to answer through the chat feature. And then some teachers disabled the chat feature entirely. And then other teachers let me call on students to unmute as well. So my biggest takeaway from all of this would be to be prepared and just be super, super flexible.
Great, thanks, Kate. So we have 2 full sets of the program materials, and Kate and I each took home a set. So we were able to both be doing things. So far, we've run 14 sessions of the program to schools in Beverly, Somerville, Canton, and Dorchester and Chinatown in Boston. These were all schools that had already booked the actual in-person colonial trades program before schools closed down physically. There are some more scheduled over the next week or so. The response from both teachers and students has been very positive. And I think for teachers of students this young and even younger, which the classes Kate were in this morning were 4-year-olds doing a totally different program. It's hard to do real instruction during class meeting times, and they're hungry for content and for special guests. In terms of payment, we are currently offering these programs for free, but making clear that we accept donations. Only our permanent staff are teaching programs. Unfortunately, we don't have any work or any money available for our part-time museum teachers. Historic New England was fortunate to get one of the PPP loans, which has covered payroll for our permanent staff to this point. And we're not looking at them as revenue generators. And also, and primarily, my biggest concern is not to place any burden of payment onto individual teachers. However, we have gotten some donations from PTOs, and that's been very much appreciated. Our education team is happy to be able to offer programming. We have longstanding relationships with most of the teachers and schools we work with, and have prioritized honoring those relationships over offering something more general. However, no one knows what school will look like in the next year. I think it's safe to assume that even if kids and teachers are allowed back in buildings, they're not going to be inviting us in, and they're not going to be going anywhere. So our next step is to figure out what we can provide that is truly useful, as long as we're in our current situation. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and if any questions have come in for Kate or I, we'd be happy to talk about them.
I should also mention for the people that are over on YouTube, we do have a NEMA staff member monitoring that. So if anybody does have questions on the live stream, you could just type them in there and we will share them. Adrian, did you want to take over?
Yeah, so I have a couple of questions in, one that I think is very specific to Carolyn and Kate, and one that I would love to hold off on and present to all of our panelists. But in the interest of time, if you could, Carolyn or Kate, or both of you, really briefly answer the question, is using the artifacts effective? Have you had any evaluation or feedback of holding up a physical artifact to the camera?
Sure. Well, it's clearly not as effective as being able to touch and smell and hopefully not lick the things as we pass them around. But I do think that having, for example, one of our then and now objects is this bundle of straw, and it acts like a sponge. And I do think that it's useful to have this here and to be able to actually compare it to what we use today, because it is not something, unlike the lantern, I probably should have shown this instead of the lantern, that is really familiar to anyone at all. So I would say, and Kate, you can agree or disagree with me, that although it's not perfect, it is effective.
And I would also add that I've been just showing that screenshot of the 2 pictures that have the then and now compared next to each other. And once I hold up the actual artifact to the camera, the kids' faces light up. So even though they're like not seeing it and touching it, just like me showing it on the camera seems to be effective.
You magically made it move.
Yes.
All right, thank you. Sorry, folks. This is my first webinar, so I'm also sort of learning on the fly and trying to be flexible, as Kate advised us. So I think there's a few questions about the differences in technology, Zoom versus Google Meet, which you addressed, Kate. Do the students or teachers have access to your slides during and or after? And there's a few questions. Is there anything better about doing virtual programs? Any potential for future applications? Some of those I think are, maybe if you could answer the access to slides. And then the other ones, I think I'm going to punt to the general Q&A, just because I do want to give our other panelists, their fair share of time to present. But maybe just quickly answering the, do they have access to your slides after you present?
Yeah, so as I said, all of these teachers were people who had already booked the program, and as part of the sort of pre-visit packet, and some of them have had it for like a decade now, but all of the slides are in there. And also I know Kate and I have had a lot of back and forth communication with all of these teachers, and are able to send them anything they want. But when we do it in the schools, the teachers do see everything in advance through the materials we send them.
Great, thank you. So I am keeping track of questions. I know there's a lot of questions coming in, but I am going to transition us to the staff people from the ICA. And while they're presenting, I'll do my best to kind of collate and synthesize some good questions for y'all. Jessie, do you want to take over?
Great, thanks, Adrienne, and hi, everybody. It's great to be here. And we're excited to present our content. I'm just going to go ahead and take a moment to share our screen. Okay. All right, everybody. Hopefully that's right. I know, Brooke, your video is on. Does my screen look good?
Looks great.
Awesome. All right. My name is Jessie. I'm the School and Family Programs Manager at the ICA Boston.
Hi, my name is Brooke Schiavelli. I'm the Family and Art Labs Program Coordinator at the ICA Boston.
And today we're going to be talking about a virtual workshop that we did in April, specifically for youth and families, that we called ICA Kids Virtual Hangout Hanging Wonders. And before we dive into our presentation, we'd love to get to know you all a little bit better. I know there's a lot of people in the webinar today, but we would love to start this experience off with, in the chat box, if you wouldn't mind sharing one thing that you've really missed during this quarantine period. So again, typing into the chat box, one thing that you've really missed during this quarantine period. I'm definitely seeing a lot of similarities and also unique things. Yes, so this is something we often try to incorporate, all sorts of ways that people can connect with us in this new virtual way. Brooke is demonstrating one of the things we often do in our workshops, jazz fingers. We also do a lot of hearts when we see something that we like or appreciate. This is amazing though. It's actually like amazing to see all the different reactions kind of coming into the chat, and hopefully everyone can see that too. And I bring this up because it's really great to form those connections, whether it's seeing somebody else type in something that you're really missing, or something that something new that maybe you didn't think that you were missing, but now you're realizing, oh man, yeah, I'm missing that too. And also really important to acknowledge that this moment has undeniably affected all of us, but it's also important to remember that we're all experiencing it really differently. And one great metaphor that I've heard is that we're traveling down the same river, but all in different boats. And I bring that up because that was something our team really talked about when we thought about how to adapt our programs virtually, especially when thinking about families. We know all families are struggling, but acknowledging that every family has different challenges and that those struggles really vary. And so just to start things off and to give folks an understanding of the ICA, if you're not familiar, we are a contemporary art museum in the Seaport area of Boston within our education department. We have about 15 part-time and full-time people on our admin team. And our department also includes all of our visitor assistants, which is roughly about 30 people. And these are our colleagues who are in the galleries, overseeing the art and also talking and engaging with visitors. And we also work with a large number of volunteers and contractors. And then within family programs, we have myself, Brooke, and then we also work with another part-time colleague. And when we think about family programs at the ICA, we really root our program goals within creative and positive youth development. So we really think about, whenever we're developing any of our programs, we think about our objectives within the context of creative growth, individual and family development, and community building.
The programs that we facilitated prior to the COVID-19 shutdown include playdates, school vacations, art lab, and books and looks. And our playdates are our family-friendly day every final Saturday of every month. The museum opens its doors to families with children. We provide art making opportunities, live performances, film screenings, and opportunities for folks to connect with each other. During school vacations, we provide opportunities for art making and connecting with contemporary artworks on view for school-age children and their families. The Art Lab is our studio classroom at the ICA where we host school and group visits, and we open to the public every weekend for hands-on art making experiences. And finally, Books and Looks is our program where our visitors' assistants offer live storytelling experiences for children, more on the younger end, for artworks, children's books that connect with artworks on view.
And so when it came time for us to think about how we would rethink our programs into a digital context, we reflected on what we were missing, making art and really building community through art. And I really appreciate everything that folks have shared in the chat about what they're really missing right now. I think some things are, really hit me on a personal level. Then some things feel very personal to others, and we really expect or respect that people are being vulnerable with us in this moment. And I think those are all things that we really miss about our in-person programming. And so when we thought about how to adapt some of our live in-person programming into this virtual way, we wanted to think about our own strengths as museum educators and also thinking about what the needs of our audiences are. There's a lot, and there still is a lot of online content. And so we wanted to think about what we could bring to the online space that felt authentic to us. And from the beginning, we felt really strongly that if we were to develop a virtual program, that we would strive to build an interactive space where kids and families could connect with themselves and engage with each other through a creative experience.
So to dive into the virtual lesson that we want to share with you today, which, as Jessie mentioned, we refer to as ICA Kids Hangout, Hanging Wonders, which was hosted over April vacation, as you all know, is at the beginning of the COVID-19 shutdown. During the 60-minute lesson, we designed hanging mobiles or sculptures made from materials that folks could find around their home or around their neighborhood, including sticks, yarn, cardboard, etc. Like Jessie said, we hosted the workshop on Zoom, and Jessie managed technology, acted as a host, and showed slides, while our colleague Flolinda monitored the chat and supported us through backup. I facilitated the art making portions using 2 webcams. One camera was showing an aerial view of my hands, demonstrating art making steps. Through developing this lesson, the key points that we found were most important were being relevant and acknowledging, as Jessie mentioned, the variety of circumstances and experiences families were having, and trying not to appear tone deaf, but really acknowledging that this moment is challenging to show up in the first place and then to show up for art making. We also wanted a sense of practicality. So like I said, household materials, not looking for anything studio grade or too fancy, and really just making what we have around us worth it and make it work. Also practical timing for children with families. And for us, it made most sense for our programs to be free, as we mimic for our programs when they're in person. And lastly, just to make a fun program that can bring joy and space and time for family bonding.
I'm going to talk a little bit about pre-workshop logistics. So this, what you're looking at, is our event page for the workshop. I've kind of consolidated our, our website into these two kind of screens here. We launched this about a week before the workshop, and we advertised it through our e-newsletter. We decided to offer the same workshop on 3 days with a recommended age range for each of those days. And we included a workshop description as well as all the materials that families would need to participate in the workshop. This was the registration form, which we did through JotForm, and families did have to register in advance of the workshop. One thing we learned is that it's really helpful to include a cutoff date and time for registrations, because we definitely received some last minute registrations like a minute before the workshop started. Overall, we received a total of 25 registrations, and we had about a 60% matriculation rate, and a total of 35 people attended the workshops. In regard to communications, we sent out 2 families to all the families who had registered. The first email included a confirmation of their registration and this PDF info sheet that included the description and materials list, along with a to-do list, artist and artwork inspiration, and educator bio. We also let everyone know that we would be using Zoom and that it would be an interactive workshop. So we let people know ahead of time that we would be asking folks to engage via video and audio. And just wanted to set this expectation ahead of time so that way we could give families an opportunity to talk to us if that was going to pose an issue for their participation. We didn't receive any concerns, and ultimately everyone was open to using video and audio. We also included a line in the email asking families to be sure to treat this virtual space with the same level of respect and care that we would encourage in any of our physical spaces or programs at the ICA. And then the second email was sent out the day before or on the morning of, depending when people registered. And that included the Zoom login information, the password, and some basic tips on Zoom. Though we found out pretty quickly that most folks, especially at this point, were pretty Zoom savvy. And finally, we did a lot of preparation and testing. We tested the Zoom platform multiple times as a team, and we did a test workshop with ICA colleagues and their families, as well as with a group of young people whom Brooke had recruited. Testing is a lot of work, and it can definitely feel awkward, but we felt it was really important, and it was, I think, key to making our workshops run as smoothly as they did.
As Jessie mentioned, we worked really hard to create a space where folks could connect within their homes, adults and children connecting together, but also to connect across homes by offering interactive opportunities. Like Jessie said, through utilizing video and audio functions, inviting thumbs up and thumbs down, using icebreakers to start the session, and creating moments for participants to share back about their artwork or their feelings or experiences during the session. We noticed that that created vulnerability. It created a sense of community, which I think we're all lacking right now. And we also encouraged art making to continue after the 60-minute session. And we provided materials for folks to follow up and review any instructions and to continue the process at home if they felt so inclined. In conclusion, again, mirroring some of what Jessie has mentioned, the main lessons, we learned so much, but really the key points through this experience that we learned were certainly to do practices, and particularly for me as the art making facilitator, I really needed to practice often and was able to pivot easily through that practice. And to rely on support from your team and institution, I can't stress how much it was helpful to have Jessie and our colleague Flo Linda supporting, so you don't feel all alone in the ocean on the internet. And lastly, everyone's needs and circumstances are constantly shifting right now during this tumultuous time, as we know. And we found it incredibly informative to ask for feedback from participants after the workshop to help inform our future virtual programming, in which we have since then created really great and exciting programs based on folks' feedback.
And since facilitating this workshop, our team planned and executed our first virtual playdate, which was a huge success for us, just being new as everyone is to virtual programming. And we definitely took advantage of everything we learned from this particular experience. And then coming up, we're also continuing to plan for not only the virtual play dates on a monthly basis, but also art making workshops that we're planning to do virtually this summer. Thank you so much for kind of tuning into our webinar today. At this point, I think, Adrienne, we'd be happy to take some questions if we have the time.
Yeah, we have just a couple minutes. Want to make sure Kate from the Gardner has her time as well, but I'm going to condense a few sort of nitty-gritty logistical questions into one. So one is, what email addresses do you use? Parents' email addresses? How do you communicate with your registrants? Could you please repeat the name of the registration platform that you used? And also, what did you find your attrition rate is between registrations and who actually showed up on the day of?
JotForm was the registration platform, and it's actually the platform that we used with our group tour program. And so one of our other colleagues on our admin team helped support that process. And I think one of the questions was about email. We, in the registration form, asked parents or guardians to provide their email address. And then we communicated for this particular workshop. We set up an alias for family programs. We didn't have a family programs dedicated email before the workshop. So we set up an alias. And then after this workshop, it kind of prompted us to create a whole separate email account specifically for family programs. And then I'm sorry, what was the last question? Or
percentage of how many folks attended versus
Mm-hmm.
registered?
About 60%.
60% showed up.
Yes.
Okay. And then a couple questions. I'm going to make this the last question so we can move on to Kate. Feedback. What suggestions did you receive from families? How did you ask for feedback from participants? Was it a formal survey or was it more informal?
We provided a formal survey afterwards, and then we also got some informal feedback because at that point I had been communicating with folks via email, so people had kind of a direct line of communication to us. And so we did put out a formal survey that we just set up on Google Forms. I think it was only like 6 questions, acknowledging that families are super busy right now, so we wanted to keep it simple. And then some families opted to just kind of give us informal feedback through email. We definitely got some good feedback about things like music or how to screen share, or like just the different like tech capacities that everybody had. And then we also kind of learned specifically with some of the older youth that we worked with, kind of ways to, I guess, like security measures in place regarding like chat and what folks can see and things like that. So it was a learning experience in that way. But I think, I think that respect and creating community goes both ways. And I think that was something that Brooke and I really were willing to experiment with and work with our audiences on.
That's great. Thank you. So thank you so much, ICA. I am going to also, before I pass it over to Kate Malazzo, I'm going to just say to my panelists, if you feel comfortable with this, if you wouldn't mind sharing emails in the chat function, just because we have a lot of questions that might not get answered today just because of time constraints. So if you feel comfortable with that, yeah, you're already doing it. And people can feel free to reach out with specific questions. But thank you so much, ICA folks. Kate, are you ready to take over?
Yes, thank you all. Let me just set my screen up here. Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon, and thank you to my co-presenters. It's great to see what everyone's been working on. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our journey piloting virtual visits at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston. So as we started this journey, we really were asking ourselves 5 guiding questions. What does our community need? How do we set up a virtual visit? How are we going to create the feeling of the Gardner Museum online? How are we going to keep our students engaged? And what have we learned? So thinking about our first question, what does our community need? So the community that I'm working with is our Thinking Through Art program. It's a professional learning community for Boston Public School teachers. It's a year-long partnership, and we're training teachers to use visual thinking strategies, or VTS, in the classroom. And VTS is a student-centered discussion method, and teachers are using this method while we're looking at works of art in the classroom. Teachers are also bringing their students for 2 on-site field trips, and that definitely got shifted, obviously, in March. And then we're working this year with 57 teachers and 2,700 students. So when everything was paused in March, we reached out to our Thinking Through Art teachers and asked, what do you need? And we offered everything from coloring sheets to virtual visits, and really wanted to hear from them. What did they need? What did their students need? And several of them responded that they'd like to try a virtual visit, and that's really where this all got started. So if we think about our next question, how do we set up a virtual visit? We really wanted to approach this in a very similar way to how we approach an on-site tour. So what do teachers, what do students need to know before they have this experience? So we tried to set expectations with our welcome letter. So I have a screenshot here on the left of this very long letter we're sending to teachers, but you can see on the right, it hopefully goes through all those different components about what to expect in this process. So we have the details of the visit. We're asking teachers to communicate with us if they have specific learning needs for their students. We're mentioning some before visit activities, and this is really a combination of activities that have already been created by the museum, such as our intro video, but we also provide a link to Google Arts and Culture. So those are 2 resources that were ready to go, but also some resources that I created. So we have 2 pre-visit activities that we're offering to teachers. One is digital, and one is actually off screen, just from feedback that I got from teachers that students like us need a screen break as well. And then we get into setting up the virtual visit. And that really goes into the technical components of setting this all up. So what we've decided with this pilot phase is that teachers invite us to their online classroom space, whether they're using Google Meet or Zoom, we join them as a guest. And then for the most part, we've been in a Zoom platform. And then therefore we ask to be made co-host, so we can share our screen, use breakout rooms. And like a few of my colleagues mentioned, if it's a different platform, we try and talk that through ahead of time, or we adapt in the moment. And then we go through our visit description. So this is really, what is this virtual visit gonna be like? So it's me coming into the classroom, the virtual classroom, introducing myself, trying to get to know the students, and then we explore 2 to 3 works of art together in an hour-long tour. And we're also asking teachers to take an active role in this online virtual experience. So really helping us manage the chat box, the technical issues, raising hands, lowering hands. So really, hopefully a partnership is formed to help us manage the presentation. And then we finish up with our post-visit activities. We move on to our next question, which probably was the most challenging. How do we create the feeling of the Gardner Museum online? So with my team, we were thinking about what we miss about the Gardner. It's immersive, it's interactive, it's multisensory. So we really came down to 2 more questions, which is how are we going to create this immersive atmosphere, and how are we going to follow our guiding pedagogy as we create these virtual visits? So we settled on using the software presentation Prezi. It's very dynamic. It's almost layering different images on top of each other. So it feels like you're traveling or zooming literally into different spaces in the museum. So hopefully feeling like you're exploring the museum together as a group, almost as you would in a group tour. So this is a screenshot of where our virtual visits begin. So we have our courtyard. And if I clicked on this top button and it says Explore Courtyard, we'd all be transported to another location or another image of the courtyard. So if we think about that second question, our guiding pedagogy, what do we really value when students come to the museum? And what we value is slowing down, looking closely, really thinking about and hearing from the students. What do they see? What are they wondering about? And we're building conversation while we're looking at a work of art. So on the left-hand side, this is another screenshot of our presentation. We have our VTS questions, or visual thinking strategies. What's going on here? What do you see that makes you say that? And what more can we find? So with all our virtual visits, we use those 3 guiding questions to facilitate a conversation while looking at an object. And you can see here we have 3 different locations in the gallery set up. So if I clicked on this top one, we'd be transported to the 3rd floor of the museum, which probably at first glance looks like a terrible idea to bring students on site. It's not the most ideal space, but there's an object that normally we wouldn't get a chance to look at closely. So if I click on the object button, we'd be able to look closely, really look closely. We don't have to worry about damaging the object. And you can see it translates very well to the online atmosphere. It's very detailed, it's very clear, and it generates a lot of rich conversation. So I would facilitate that VTS conversation while students were looking with that in the same way as classroom teachers would help me. So if students were unmuting themselves and felt comfortable doing that, maybe they're raising and lowering their hands, maybe they're responding in the chat box. So kind of following the same kind of guidelines and routines the classroom teacher had already set up. After we look closely at an object, we're also thinking about its installation. So that really prompted us to make this button, which is, where is it? So thinking about, where does this object live in our collection? And it actually lives over here on the left-hand side. So we find it together as a group, and we think about, why would Mrs. Gardner, who we often call an installation artist, why would she put this object here? She placed every single object in our museum, and it's really great to talk to students about why you think she put this object where she did. If we take a step back and we think about using this object on site, it wouldn't work very well. If we have this narrow passageway and we're trying to get 15 students around this big tapestry, it would be very difficult to see. But in this case, it works very well in this online learning atmosphere. How do we keep students engaged? So I just mentioned, for all of our virtual visits, we're having VTS conversations. We're slowing down and we're doing close looking all together, and I'm facilitating that conversation. But we're also thinking about other ways to engage our students. So this is a movement activity that I did with younger groups this week in our courtyard. So you can probably see my terrible tracing skills using the Zoom annotate button. So I used the feature draw, and I'm tracing one of the plants in our courtyard. And as I'm tracing, I'm actually asking students to trace with me with their fingers. And we're talking about line and form and shape. And as I finish the tracing and finish kind of talking about all those aspects, I ask students to become the shape. So on the count of 3, I ask the class to change their bodies and freeze in a tableau and become this plant. So it's just a little bit different way to engage with a space and this image, but also still be in our courtyard. And I boxed in this lower right hand side, there's a box with a sculpture in our courtyard, and that's to show you that we have sketching time in our virtual visits. And that's really about giving students some agency and some decision making during the virtual visit. They can decide what's aesthetically pleasing to them, what do they want to look at, and really closely interact with for 5 minutes during our tour. While we're in the courtyard, we've also been practicing mindfulness. It's been the last few months and the recent weeks, there's been so much going on, and just being mindful that students are processing the current events in many different ways. We see the courtyard space at the Gardner as a place of peace, of sanctuary, a place to reflect. So doing some breathing exercises while looking at images of our courtyard hopefully gives them a chance to just pause, be a little more centered, grounded, just be together in that virtual visit. We've also been thinking about student communication. Students are going to feel just a variety of comfort levels as adults do, communicating in this digital space. So they might not feel as comfortable unmuting themselves and asking a question or sharing their idea out loud. So in this particular activity, I'm working with a painting and asking students to think about the 5 senses. And as they're thinking about the 5 senses, they're writing to me in the chat box a word they're associating with each sense. I'm reading those words out loud so they can hear it. But then you can see on the right-hand side, I'm also creating a word wall with the text box in Zoom. So there's 2 ways that I'm validating their responses, but also building a little bit of community and working together in this activity. What have we learned? Just as my other colleagues have said, you learn a lot. You learn probably something new each time. Students are learning, teachers are learning, technology is learning how to be better, which means we have to learn more things. I'm learning, so it's just constantly learning. I don't know if there's a better way to say that. But one of the things that's been helpful for us is Google Forms. So we've been sending these forms to teachers after their visits, and they've been really helpful as far as how they thought the virtual visit went, some thoughts for us for changes, how they thought their students were engaging. And so we're going to use all that information and we're going to apply that as we continue to plan for the summer and in the fall. And my takeaways, much like how we started this presentation, my big takeaway is be flexible with everything. There's lots of moving parts with these virtual visits and technology and working with content and different formats. So just being flexible through and through to collaborate. And I think about that in 2 ways. I think about that with classroom teachers. They're really our partners, especially before, during, and after the visit, really understanding what their student needs, making sure that we're partners during the virtual visit. So we're following each other's lead so the whole visit can be successful for all students who are participating. And I also think about collaborate with our organization. So across departments and also across the museum field, because everyone's trying to reach different audiences. So brainstorming together and showing people what you're working on is really helpful to get some feedback and maybe get new ideas. And then finally, prepare for multiple scenarios. I think about that in the short term, such as always sending images and content ahead of time so students can access them, teachers can access them. If your technology fails and you're unable to share your screen, someone has them. And also having a few different activities in your back pocket in case something's not working. But I also think of it in the long term that we really have so many unknowns with the summer, the fall, the school year. So really starting to think about where we can apply these virtual visits and starting to think creatively about it. So thank you so much for your time. And if we have time, we can take some questions. And I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Kate.
Sure.
So we are right up against 3 o'clock. I was chatting a little bit with the panelists, and it seems like most of us are able to stay a few minutes over. So if you need to leave, by all means, but if you have a few moments, I think we have a couple questions to throw out to the panelists. I'm seeing a lot of questions relating to accessibility. And I know, Kate, you mentioned in yours, the text box, as well as audibly reading things out loud. But a question for all of the panelists. Have you run into issues of accessibility, students who are hard of hearing, maybe students with low vision, anything like that, or even technology related? I'm seeing a lot of questions that ask about if students are accessing your program via their phones or on iPads, things like that. Anyone can answer this, but have you run into issues, and do you have solutions for anything around that?
So not with this program that we talked about today with Colonial Trades, which we have been doing, as we said, live, but we also, some of the other education coordinators have done presentations that are on YouTube that are unlisted, which means that you need a private link to get into them, and those have closed captioning available to them. And some schools that they're working with are not doing synchronous learning, they're doing asynchronous learning. And so that's helpful, and also helpful in terms of accessibility.
Anyone else? Jesse, you popped on. Do you have anything?
I kind of thought we were all popping on at this point, but I think it's an ongoing conversation that our team has been having. And I think because all of the planning for virtual programs is still so new to us, we're kind of in the seat of like listening to our audiences and finding out what the needs are. And we're kind of, in a place where we can really think about personalization and customization. So when issues have been brought up, I think right now we have the capacity to be able to kind of troubleshoot or redesign or rethink a program to fit the participants in the best way. And then I think specifically for family programs, I mean, something that we've really realized with our temporary closure and having to move on to a digital space is kind of seeing that working in this way is actually, I think, a big advantage in reaching family audiences. I think Brooke kind of mentioned it briefly in one of the Q&A answer boxes, but it allows us to reach families in a different way, and it allows us to widen our reach. And, we're not just doing virtual live programs, but we've created online activities. We've thought about different types of workshops that we can offer, having those workshops then uploaded as pre-recorded videos that people can access on their own time. So thinking through not just one layer of engagement, but different opportunities to reach different access points.
Yeah, I'll just add that I had an experience with technology and accessibility that during one of my tours, one of the students couldn't hear me. So the teacher and I were able to figure that out, and she was able to type what I was asking students, and that student was able to respond in the chat box. So I agree with Jesse, there's a lot more to think about, but that was kind of the in the moment fix. But we do need to think about these more deeply so we can reach more students and more groups.
Kate, there is a follow-up question about what is your headset that you're using?
Yeah, so this headset, this was funny. This was, I forgot my other headset at work, which is not as, we'll say, strong as this one. And this one, I think I got a month after I wanted to order it right after everything happened, and then I didn't get it a month later, and I actually don't know what it is, but I will follow up with you. I got it at Staples. I don't even know what the type is.
Yeah, no, I have a headset too, and I end up using my headset for my phone. So
got it.
It does help with the audio.
It does.
I've noticed it does. Yeah.
It does. Yeah. Especially hearing students, and it's been great.
So another general question for all of the panelists. Is there anything distinctly better about virtual versus in person? I know Kate mentioned being able to look at an object that is otherwise difficult for students to see. And sort of a part B of that question, are any of you planning on keeping or staying virtual for any programs after we are able to reopen and start doing in person again?
Maybe. Everything is a possibility right now, as far as I'm concerned.
I talked about it a little bit earlier, but kind of realizing how working in this online virtual way actually allows us to widen our reach with families in particular. So because of the temporary closure, we developed a new website specifically for relating to our art lab space, which is our studio classroom at the ICA. And we've been developing weekly activities and prompts and ideas that families and really anybody can download. And so that's something actually we're thinking of continuing to do, because it really does allow families to reach us and to engage with us when it's convenient for them. Because I know that that's one of the biggest barriers for families to be able to attend, because previously all our programs were in person, and we all know families are busy, things come up at the last minute, you have all the right intentions of showing up at the program at 10 a.m., but life happens. So this allows us to actually reach families on a different level and make us more accessible.
I agree. I think Carolyn mentioned it before. We're just not sure what the timeline's going to be. So I think we could be doing these depending on the groups for a while, and just thinking about maybe adult groups, university, like if you think about trying to reach all those audiences, I think there's definitely a need for virtual visits to continue for a while.
Great. So we're still holding pretty strong over on Zoom, about 80 attendees. So I might risk it and ask one more question. Since this is down to the details, there's been a few mentions on panelists about cost of programming. So a few questions in the chat and Q&A. How much do you feel like this has cost? It seems like most of your programs have been developed by you who are already employed by your institutions, but maybe a better way of saying that is, have you gotten a lot of institutional support? Have you had to advocate for developing these programs, since it does take time, your time away from other work tasks? But feel free, anyone, to jump in and kind of talk about the cost or the return on investment, like that kind of money stuff, which sometimes is not fun to talk about. But
I'll go first. So for us, there really haven't been any additional costs. And in terms of return on investment, this has allowed our full-time education staff to continue doing our actual jobs. And so there has not been any sort of pushback. There's been full support. And I mentioned during our presentation how helpful our IT team has been. And, you know, we are a big organization, but we're actually in some ways a whole bunch of really small independent, we're not independent. Anyway, all our different sites are doing different things. And we have 3 people that do IT for everyone. And they've been working so hard and have been so extremely supportive. But then there's been total institutional buy-in, because we are still able to be interacting with the kids that we would have been interacting with in person if we were able to.
And I would just add to that is that we've been able to serve an audience right now where most of the other aspects of our museum haven't really been able to serve an audience. So it's been a way for us to kind of stay relevant in this time.
Great, thank you so much. So I am looking at the time, and I do think it's probably about time that we wrap up this fabulous conversation. But again, if you have, I know that we didn't get to every question. So if you have specific questions, feel free to reach out to the panelists. If you're having a hard time finding them, feel free to email gbmerinfo@gmail.com, and Catherine or I will help facilitate that connection. And last plug, we are planning a round 2 of this style of webinar, focusing a little bit more on more public programs or adult programming, whereas this one was a little bit more school aged or family. So if anyone out there wants to present, feel free, shoot us an email at gbmerinfo@gmail.com, and we would love to facilitate another webinar similar to this one. I think this was a really valuable conversation, and I know I've been frantically taking notes for my own work. So panelists, is there any last final thoughts that you'd like to communicate? If not, I'm going to hand it over to Heather so she can wrap us up.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for all of those that stayed off after a little bit later. I also want to mention that we do have our call for proposals for our new virtual conference. Make sure you check out the website for that one. The deadline is this Friday, but you know, if you contact us, we can work around that. And stuff like that. Again, if you do have any programming ideas that you would like to see NEMA do, just shoot us an email. We are always open for exploring new topics, especially ones that are of interest to our membership. And I would just want to say thank you to all of our presenters today. I appreciate that you guys are willing to share your knowledge of exactly what you guys are doing, especially knowing that you guys had to do it very quickly to get the content online. So that's always a good thing to see and hear and see what everybody's doing and stuff. So just say thank you, and I hope to see you guys all again at another NEMA Town Hall webinar or workshop. So Bye, you guys.